All right, world history. I am going to walk you through the beginning years of the Cold War in Europe. So the Cold War really affected the whole world, but for today's class, we're just going to focus on what was happening in Europe right after World War II ended, and how is it going to set up this tension that's really going to go all the way until the 1990s. And even some of this we're still kind of seeing coming back today as we're looking at what's going on right now in Ukraine. So a lot of this is pretty timely. So let's get started. Okay, so first off, you guys know that World War II ended and Germany surrendered. And the Allies knew what not to do. They knew to avoid just giving a ridiculous punishment to Germany, like, humongous payments, all the blame, and then leaving, because that clearly didn't work out for them very well after World War One. So we're going to see that first FDR and Stalin, and then later Stalin and Truman, are going to kind of argue about what to do with a defeated Germany. They knew they needed a presence there and to help them rebuild and get back on their feet. But they're gonna argue over really how far that should go. Um, at Yalta, I put up there on the notes, bargaining away Eastern Europe. What we're going to see is at the Yalta Conference, when Stalin is meeting with Franklin Roosevelt, he is going to insist upon having control over Poland specifically, but other countries in Eastern Europe. And of course, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were pretty concerned about that, and they felt like he just wanted to extend communism. Well, he said he needed those for defense. He needed to make sure that an aggressor like Germany never got aggressive again, and he was saying he just wanted to protect his own country. At this point, the Allies know that they still really need Stalin. They need the Soviet Union. We talked about what a huge role they played in World War II. So they're going to somewhat bargain away Eastern Europe here to keep Stalin happy and keep him on their side. So they agree. Now, Stalin does promise he will give free elections in Poland, and surprise, surprise, that never happens. But he does promise that. So they agree to sort of let him have a good amount of control over not just Poland, but Eastern Europe. And this is kind of the beginning we're going to see here of this tension. We've got, if you look at this map, you can see that Germany is divided into four different sectors. And a sector is on your study guide. It just means an occupied zone. So you can see which countries, which of the four allied major powers were controlling different areas of Germany, and their role was to help them rebuild. And then the goal was for them to leave. But we're going to see one of those things is not like the other one, right? Look at the one in the East, Soviet Union. They're communists, the other three countries are not. So it's just kind of natural that they're going to argue about what should go on within their sector. If you look where the city of Berlin is, do you see it pretty deep there in the Soviet sector? That's the capital of Germany. So they decided to also divide up Berlin, much in the way that they divided up Germany, because it was so important. And so everybody kind of wanted to stay there too. Stalin wasn't crazy about that, but he eventually kind of agreed to it. Okay. So, just like I said, they're going to divide the city of Berlin. It's in the middle of the Soviet sector. So, in each part of the city, those particular Allied powers were in control. They had troops on the ground, and they're making sure that things are happening the way that they see fit. All right. There's President Harry Truman. He takes over after Franklin Roosevelt. And he's going to come up with this idea called containment, which he puts in what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. Now, pretty much across Europe, you guys know, I mean, Europe was devastated after World War II. Most of Europe had been through now two world wars in a span of 20 to 25 years. The rebuilding was just staggering, the jobs that were ahead of them. And so the other thing is when people don't have a lot, communism does sound pretty good. We talked about that. It does have guarantees. And so a lot of people in Europe were starting to kind of think, hey, maybe we should try communism out. And Greece and Turkey are going to be the two countries that we see. There's quite a bit of trouble. There's a pretty strong pro-communist movement there. And President Truman decided to kind of make a statement here. He pledged aid to the non-communists in Greece and Turkey here in 1947. And he really just said that I'm going to support whoever is against the communists, and we need to contain communism. So that's the policy of containment. Notice he doesn't say we're going to get rid of it in Poland and in the rest of Eastern Europe where it already is, but he says we're going to make sure it doesn't spread anymore. Okay, so that's what containment's all about. So this becomes the US policy from this point on about communism. I think the United States knew to a certain extent they couldn't do anything about what had already happened in Eastern Europe, but they made it their policy to make sure communism did not spread. Okay, the other thing we're going to see happen here in these early years is we get something called the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is a plan devised here in the United States, and really for us, it was kind of a win-win situation. We figured that if we invested $13 billion in aid to non-communist countries, um, they were going to not only get back on their feet faster, but then, be relatively happy about our help there and be good trading partners. So it was kind of an investment here. We actually offered it to the Eastern European countries, but they did not accept it. And I put up there, why do you think they didn't accept it? Well, a lot of that had to do with the fact that Stalin was really in control. Even though you look at that map and you see those countries in Eastern Europe, and yeah, they have their own boundaries, they have their own borders, but Stalin was pretty much dominating what was going on in each of those countries. So what's going to happen is that Western Europe is going to get all of this money after World War II to rebuild, but Eastern Europe is not. Stalin said he'd take care of it. It never happened, okay, or it happened very slowly. So this is where I was talking about the firebombing of the city of Dresden. And when I was there in the year 2000, they were still rebuilding it because it was in the East. That money just never came, under the communist system. And so you can still kind of see a bit of a difference between East and West, even to this day. So this is in 1948, but we're talking long-term effects felt here, economic effects that you can still see today. Okay. Now, what we're going to see happen here, the first real sign of trouble, is when the three sectors in Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, all decide to merge. And they just kind of announce that they are merging and they are forming what's now going to be referred to as West Germany. Well, Stalin, of course, is furious, and he says, well, fine, then my sector's East Germany, and by the way, I'm closing off access to Berlin, so have fun getting there. Have fun helping out your sectors that you're supposed to help in Berlin, because that's in my territory, and I'm blocking all the roads. So that's what he did. So this is our first real major showdown between the two major superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, that have kind of emerged from the ashes of World War II. So what Harry Truman decides to do is sort of call Stalin's bluff and say, all right, if I can't drive to Berlin, I'm going to fly to Berlin. So that's what you're seeing here in this picture. And this becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. So for almost 11 months here, American planes flew to our sector in Berlin and literally dropped supplies, clothing, candy, food, blankets, all kinds of stuff from the sky. And so who looks bad here? Stalin looks bad here, right? And that's the thing, that this was kind of a pretty good move for Truman because it really made Stalin look like the bad guy, even though what he was doing was reacting to the United States' initial policy. So it was kind of a master here in public relations and flipping it on its other side. So it became this kind of poker game, I say, between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is really a good analogy for the Cold War. A lot of threats. A lot of kind of calling each other's bluff and trying to see who's going to back down first. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade relatively quietly. We don't see a war threatened or anything over here, but this is the sign that not only that there's trouble between the US and the Soviet Union, but Berlin is going to be a problem. Berlin is going to be the center of this trouble because it's just kind of this clash between the East and West and this communist versus non-communist. So this is not going to be the last time we're going to hear about Berlin. Now, communism, of course, was the biggest threat to us, right? But nuclear weapons were something that we were the only ones really who had. And so we were the only ones who had them until 1949. So in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests a nuclear weapon. Well, now it's a whole new ballgame. Because nuclear weapons are, great if you're the only one that has them. But now that they have them, we're going to start trying to grab as many as we can. We're going to start lining them up at each other and threatening to use them. So this is where we get the term Cold War. The Cold War is really not a war like we saw with World War I or World War II. It's a war of words. It's a war of philosophy. It's fought by things like threats, trying to outdo each other in weapons, which is called the arms race, trying to beat each other to space, which is going to be referred to as the space race, which, by the way, Sputnik is the Soviet satellite that beat the United States. I mean, they got there first, and that's going to be something that sort of catches us off guard and makes us really pour money into space exploration and make President Kennedy eventually promise to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which we do, but boy, we cut it close, about 6 months, right? Um, it's a lot of fear, a lot of suspicion on both sides. So a lot of covert operations, a lot of spying on each other, and just trying to expand your influence as much as possible. So the United States and the Soviet Union are both trying to spread their ideas in different parts of the world. Latin America, Africa, Asia. We're going to see it really all over the world. So this is why when I say the Cold War Europe, it's really an event that happens over the entire world, but we're going to focus mostly in this unit on Europe. We're going to come back and see what happens in other places. Okay, Winston Churchill gave a pretty famous speech in 1947 where he said the quote, "An iron curtain has descended across Europe." Now, what does he mean? You look at this map and you can see there's a division, isn't there? There's an sort of this unofficial curtain that is dividing East and West. And so the communism is going to be on the red side, and that's more Eastern Europe, with the exception really of Greece and Turkey. Look at Greece and Turkey and remember, because of Truman's policy in 1947, we made sure that those countries would stay non-communist. Other than that, pretty much every other country in the East is going to be communist. Pretty much every country in the West is not. So there's an unofficial sort of division here. We'll see an actual division, of course, pretty soon. We'll actually see barbed wire go up between Austria and Hungary. We'll see a wall in Berlin, and we'll get to that later. So we've got two military alliances created after World War II. The communist one is called the Warsaw Pact, and that was really Stalin's answer to the non-communist one, which was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So once NATO is created, that Stalin says, well, then I'm making my own too, and so we're seeing them divide into teams and divide up Europe. I'm going to go back to Cuba later. I'm going to skip Cuba for now because I really want you guys to learn about Berlin first. So we're going to talk about Berlin and then we'll get into Cuba. Okay, so from 1949, which was the end of the blockade, until about 1961, a lot of people were leaving East Berlin, which is where the Soviet Union was in control, and going to the little sort of island of non-communism of West Berlin, which is in the middle of the communist Soviet sector. So there was no wall. You could just walk across the street and go into the French quarter, or the American sector, and you were free. So a lot of people were doing that. So about 3 million East Germans were leaving through Berlin, through West Berlin, and getting out of the communist system between 1949 and 1961. Well, remember, communism only works if you stay put, really, and do your job, right? Or else, otherwise, it throws off the system. So this was a problem. And this was a problem. We're going to see Nikita Khrushchev is going to be the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin, who's going to deal with this. And Khrushchev had actually come to the United States, met with President Eisenhower. Things looked like, hey, maybe they're going in the right direction. Well, then we got caught spying red-handed. We had a U-2 spy plane shot down. Now, to be fair, the Soviets were spying on us too. We were spying on them. Everybody's spying on each other in the Cold War. That's how it goes. But we got caught red-handed, and Khrushchev decided to make a big issue out of it. And he sort of used it as an excuse to say, that's it. I'm closing the border to Berlin. So what you're seeing here happening is August 13th, 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, ordered a wall to be constructed around West Berlin. I always thought the wall was to keep people from getting in or from getting out places, but it was really to keep people from getting in, because if once people could get into West Berlin, then that was their ticket out of East Germany. So he puts this wall up to keep people in East Berlin, and West Berliners were not allowed out. Sometimes they were allowed out, but it was very, very difficult. It divided families, it divided friends. East Berliners were not allowed in any way, shape, or form to go into West Berlin. And so this was a pretty big deal. Now, the United States, and President Kennedy's in charge at this point, he's disgusted by this. This is really concerning to us, but not quite enough to go to war over Berlin. Because remember, the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons, guys. So the next World War is going to involve those. And I think Kennedy knew that, and he wants to avoid that. So he definitely made a strong statement about this. He said we would stand by our people in our sector in West Berlin, and we condemn the wall, but we don't do anything to stop it. So I think the East Berliners really felt just kind of disheartened by that action. So this wall goes up, and it will remain in place until 1989. Actually, it's still there today. It's just not guarded. So look at this map here. You'll see West Berlin, that's the yellow. The wall went all the way around West Berlin. So the East Berliners, and really anyone from any part of East Germany,